food security. Because of the intimate connections between climate change, agriculture, and rural poverty, it is important to look at climate change impacts on rural communities and especially on rural women. So towards this end, for the purposes of the study, we interviewed Amihan, a national organization of peasant women in the Philippines, with members in 32 provinces. So according to Amihan, the most apparent manifestation of climate change has to do with changes in rain patterns. Erratic monsoons disrupt planting seasons and adversely affect crop yields with devastating consequences for livelihoods and economic security. According to Amihan, the climate change crisis has disproportionate effects on women farmers vis-a-vis men farmers in at least 3 ways. First, women manage, control, and own lesser resources, especially land, than men. Thus, when harvests collapse either because of floods or droughts, women have fewer assets to sell to cope with the situation. Second, women are the main borrowers in agricultural households. Women borrow more than men in part because they have greater access to microcredit, but also because women as managers of production and household expenses are under stronger pressure to bridge resource gaps. Hence, more women than men fall into chronic indebtedness related to climate-induced crop failures. Third, when food shortages arise from poor harvests linked to weather problems, women are the last to eat in their households, prioritizing the food needs of male household members and children over their own. Climate change is now a reality that rural communities in the Philippines have to contend with the increasing occurrence of floods and droughts in the last couple of decades. People in the countryside have had little choice but to begin to adjust to extreme weather variations, and this slide shows some of the adaptation or the agricultural adaptation techniques employed by rural communities, such as practicing crop diversification, etc. These are accompanied by a wide range of financial coping mechanisms, which, stripped of euphemism, translate to migration, indebtedness, loss of economic assets, and even hunger. With limited resources and support, though, women farmers in the Philippines are organizing and strategizing to mitigate and adapt to climate change in order to secure their livelihoods and access to basic needs. In particular, Amihan members are increasingly engaged in organic farming initiatives, integrated pest management programs, agroforestry, and tree planting projects. However, Amihan realizes that agricultural strategies to alleviate and adjust to climate change are only one part of the answer. Awareness building, community organization, and political engagement are equally critical. So Amihan is beginning, for instance, to convene community discussions on the problem of climate change. It is currently lobbying the Philippine Congress to repeal the 2006 Biofuels Act. And more fundamentally, Amihan is pushing for the passage of a genuine agrarian reform bill, which, aside from addressing basic issues of justice and equity, will also encourage farmers to invest in climate proofing by establishing certainty of land tenure. Amihan, in particular, calls for government support and funds directed towards rural communities, especially rural women, for the provision of subsidized organic seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides, access to affordable, sustainable agricultural technologies, dissemination of agroforestry techniques, and provision of low-interest farm credit and crop insurance schemes specifically targeted at small farmers. And as I mentioned earlier, they also continue to demand for a genuine agrarian reform program that secures women's land rights, and allows women to manage their own lands in such a way as to lessen greenhouse gas emissions, as well as increase agricultural resilience to variable weather conditions. I will not go into all of the Philippine government response to the climate change challenge, but just to say that a review of the country's climate change policies and development plans gives a sense that the issue of climate change remains peripheral to the Philippine government's macroeconomic goal of achieving sustained economic growth, even though it is becoming increasingly clear that climate change will have adverse consequences even for the latter effort. The primary government response to climate change has been to establish organizational mechanisms such as the Presidential Task Force on Climate Change, yet organizational capacities to assess and respond to mitigation and adaptation remains weak. Moreover, climate change policies thus far have a disproportionate focus on mitigation, especially on the promotion of renewable energy. This is reflective of a reference, or rather, reflective of a preference for hard, scientific, and technology-based solutions over soft policies, quote-unquote soft policies, that address socioeconomic needs and differences. Additionally, while land use, particularly agriculture, is the foremost cause of greenhouse gas emissions in the country, very little has been done on mainstreaming an ecologically friendly land use policy. Meanwhile, adaptation measures remain woefully inadequate and are geared more towards disaster risk reduction and management, particularly the implementation of large-scale infrastructure projects such as flood control projects, rather than projects that protect agricultural and coastal livelihoods, that build food security and ensure people's access to basic needs. In short, there is a wide disconnect between current government policies for climate change mitigation and adaptation and the priorities and needs articulated by poor rural women. The existing sources of climate change finance in the Philippines include national government spending, subsidies and incentives, national private sector spending, foreign direct investments, international debt, official development assistance. Future directions for mobilizing funds for climate change mitigation and adaptation can be gleaned from the Presidential Task Force on Climate Change preliminary Philippine climate change strategic framework. However, the framework does not offer much in terms of concrete, innovative financing solutions. Rather, it highlights the need to tap ODA, or official development assistance, explore market-based incentives, etc. There are also several climate change-related bills being discussed by the Philippine Congress, for most of which is Senate Bill 1890, which is an act establishing the framework program for climate change. I will not go into the bill so much, just to say that the revised version of the Senate bill promotes mainstreaming of climate change mitigation and adaptation in all government agencies by calling them to allocate adequate funds for national and local implementation of climate change programs from their existing budgets. The revised bill also encourages government-owned and controlled financial institutions to formulate and identify loans and financing mechanisms to support local climate change plans. It also empowers local government units to raise revenues and secure funds to implement their local climate change adaptation plans, for instance, through the enactment of tax ordinances, etc.